one sound down here, and I promise I'll kill the both of you. Not just punish you, kill you.
Sadly, real-life tales of abuse and death are rife for adaptation and discussion. Look at the last 5 years or so, and true crime podcasts, documentaries, and TV shows are all the rage with serial killers, people that just plain snapped, and other shocking real-life tales. Sometimes even authors get their gruesome ideas and characters from real life, as is the case with underrated and underdiscussed horror author Jack Ketchum. One of his works, The Girl Next Door, was turned into a movie in 2007, and the movie tells you based on a true story. Now, sometimes that's just advertising, but in this case, it's terrifying and all too real. Keep an eye on your neighbors, and if you see something, say something, as we find out what the f*** really happened to the girl next door. Jack Ketchum, whose real name was Dallas William Meyer, was a fairly prolific horror author who wrote over 25 novels and short story collections. He wrote under a pen name, Jersey Livingston, when he was publishing multiple stories in multiple magazines, but his main run was from 1981 to 2017, and he passed away in 2018 after a battle with cancer. He was known for his brutality in his stories, and his first novel, The Off-Season, had some controversy behind it. It was somewhat based on the tale of Scottish cannibal Sonny Bean, a tale that also inspired Wes Craven's The Hills Have Eyes. Ketchum would read about the brutal treatment and horrible death of Sylvia Likens, one of the state of Indiana's most brutal crimes, and soon write the novel The Girl Next Door that was published in 1989. Ketchum's novels would begin to be adapted into films starting with The Lost in 2006. The very next year, The Girl Next Door would be turned into a feature-length film that would wow enough on the festival circuit that premium network stars would pick up the distribution rights. It would appear both in the Starz network as well as get a DVD release that same year. Ketchum would write the book from the perspective of the neighbor to disassociate himself from some of the horror and even leave out some of the real-life events he felt were far too disturbing to write. If you've read a Ketchum novel, you know that says something. The movie was written by Philip Nutman and Daniel Farrens. While Nutman has virtually nothing else to his name, Farrens gave us the glorious and divisive Halloween 6: The Curse of Michael Myers, and directed the comprehensive documentaries His Name Was Jason and Never Sleep Again. Director Gregory Wilson has only one other film to his resume, and it's the 2012 straight-to-video adaptation of Ghoul from author Brian Keene. The acting team in front of the camera includes Ghostbusters' William Atherton, Blanche Baker, who may be most famous as Ginny from 16 Candles, and a cameo from Breaking Bad's Mark Margolis. The kid actors, in a humorous and ironic turn, all had roles in various Law & Order and CSI episodes, where in this movie they could have used those teams. The movie starts with William Atherton, who plays the adult version of David Moran, sleepwalking through life and never uttering a word, only narrating for us. He sees a homeless man struck by a car and is the only one that rushes to save him. The man's taken away by an ambulance, and our narrator discusses what true pain is. He wants anything to numb the feelings he lives with from a childhood experience. He doesn't feel the need to tell his wife what happened in the summer of 1958, but he's damn sure going to explain it to us. We are transported back in time when a young man, David is a boy, meets his new neighbor Meg, and he is instantly infatuated with her. This is how the author of the book and writers of the screenplay decided to give the audience eyes. Ketchum was so disturbed by the real events that occurred to Sylvia that he created a whole different character to experience them, as well as give the story any kind of hero. While the neighbors of Sylvia and her murderous caretaker Gertrude Benazuski were ever so slightly involved, there was no neighbor boy who was central to the events. We find out that Meg was in a car accident with her family where her parents were killed, but her sister Susan, who had polio, also survived. They now live with their Aunt Ruth and her 3 sons, Ralphie, Donnie, and Willie. We follow David as he meets up with some of the neighborhood kids, including the children of Ruth. They are reckless and abusive with each other in both their language and games, but gel together well. David ends up at the summer carnival and goes on the Ferris wheel with Meg as it was her first time, and they grow even closer. Meg alludes to her caretaker Ruth being funny sometimes, and that she needs to be home kinda early tonight. Here's where the stand-ins for the real story start to closely resemble fact. Ruth is a stand-in for Gertrude, who was the aunt of Sylvia and her sister Jenny. Gertrude had 3 divorces and was in charge of 7 children alone by the time she was 36. While the movie depicts just the 3 sons, Gertrude had daughters Paula, Stephanie, Marie, and Shirley, as well as sons John, James, and Dennis. They ranged from ages 1 to 17 by the time Sylvia and her sister Jenny were sent to live with her and her kids. Instead of a fatal car accident, it was the arrest of their mother Elizabeth that had their father Lester ask Gertrude for the two girls to board with her. After Elizabeth was released, the two carnival working parents moved to the East Coast with the carnival and agreed to pay Gertrude $20 a week to have the girls live with her. Unlike the film, the two girls had 3 other siblings, though none of them stayed with the same house. Similar to the film, though, the first few weeks were rather calm for Sylvia and Jenny. The movie then shows us what the Chandler household was like. Ruth would invite the neighborhood kids over and have very little rules. She would supply them with beer and tell them about things they probably shouldn't know about at the ages that they were. Ruth takes all the boys to the carnival and verbally abuses Meg on the way out.
And stay out of the icebox. Can't have you getting fat on us.
The boys all spend the night and try to peep on Meg changing, a scary sign of things to come. Ruth has everyone do chores, including burning out the caterpillars in the backyard, but Meg refuses. Later at the pool, Meg begs David to buy her food because she hasn't had any in the last 48 hours. She claims she can't eat because Ruth says she's getting too fat. The abuse in real life started when the payments for the housing of the two girls were late and eventually stopped. Gertrude actually beat the sisters' bare bottoms and blamed them for the events. She started with both, but eventually just focused solely on Sylvia with continued physical abuse, but also starvation. When she did allow her to eat, it was spoiled food out of the garbage. The movie then moves on to the abuse portion of our tale. Neighbor David receives a painting from Meg and, in an attempt to sway Meg into Ruth's favor, claims it was from her. This backfires, and the next day Meg makes the mistake of defending herself while the Chandler boys tickle her and one touches her breast. Meg runs off and Ruth punishes her sister Susan by proxy, something that will become a sad running theme. Meg finally goes to the police at the fair, but nothing comes of it except for further punishment from Ruth. David is allowed to spend the night and discovers in horror that Meg is now strung up from the ceiling in the basement, and the kids begin a terrible game, egged on by Ruth. They strip her and let her hang while her sister watches. The abuse in real life was similar to what is depicted in the film. Gertrude accused Sylvia of laying with boys, and that made her unclean even though her own daughter Paula was pregnant. While the verbal abuse and mind games were there, the physical abuse came more frequently and from everyone in the household. Paula once punched Sylvia so hard it broke her wrist, and angered, she hit her even harder after a cast had been applied. Gertrude would beat her with a belt and even kicked her in the crotch upon learning information. The other kids in the house tried their best as well. On one occasion, after long bouts of not eating, they force-fed Sylvia a fully loaded hot dog, and when she vomited that up, they made her ingest that too. While all this is horrifying, Sylvia wasn't immediately strung up like she was in the movie, and also never went to the police at a carnival. In fact, very little was said to anyone, as she constantly feared retaliation. The movie spirals, and Meg becomes a complete prisoner. She doesn't go to school and isn't allowed anywhere in the house except the basement, mostly tied up. She struggles to eat and drink due to the dehydration and abuse, and the 3 boys in the house constantly want to abuse her. David asks his father in a roundabout way about the abuse, and even saying something about when you see something. The father, in stereotypical 50s dad fashion, says sometimes it's okay to beat on a woman, if they deserve it. David and Jenny begin to get closer, and Jenny has given up on saving herself or her sister, and now the neighborhood kids are in on the beatings and abuse. Ruth moves on to having her children cut Meg and put out cigarettes on the poor girl. The police officer that Meg tried to tell does show up to the house, and while he sees it's all in disarray, he doesn't make it down to the basement to find anything. Sadly, much of the abuse on screen was based on real events. Other kids from school, including a boy that one of Gertrude's daughters was seeing, would come over and beat on Sylvia. They would also cut her, and cigarettes were put out on Sylvia's body up to 100 times. While Sylvia and Jenny never told the police what was happening, they did tell one of their older sisters who happened to be in town. Unfortunately, they weren't able to remember the address they were staying at, and nothing came of it right away. The sibling did eventually end up at the house, but Gertrude told her she was not to see her sisters, and she was in complete control. In another sad turn of events, one that is sadly a sign of the times, Sylvia continued to go to school instead of being kept at the house, and she was beaten and tortured throughout the entire home, rather than just in the basement. Even the girl's parents came by, but witnessed none of the abuse, and although neighbors did come by and were disgusted by the treatment they saw, they never reported it to anyone. Things in the movie get dire as David plans an escape for Meg. She is stopped sadly when she attempts to save her younger sister, and the punishment is severe beatings followed by forced intercourse with Ruth's oldest son. The act is witnessed by the family and neighborhood children, as well as her sister being forced to watch. Ralphie decides that she needs to be marked, and Ruth allows a scarlet letter type message to be carved into her abdomen, but decides that it must go further to remove the lust from her mind. The final act includes Ruth burning out her genitals with a torch. David is now captured as well when he lets his intentions of getting help known, and they set a trap by lighting a fire. Ruth comes downstairs and is killed by David while the police come back and arrest the remaining boys. The abuse was too much, however, and Meg perishes from her wounds. Our narrator will never forgive himself, but will always remember the love that he had. Eventually, the beatings and other abuse led Sylvia to becoming incontinent. She was no longer sent to school, and it was here that she was tied up in the basement. While movie Ruth was akin to a cult leader, Gertrude would lie and trick her children into continuing the abuse by saying that Sylvia would say and do things to them. Eventually, Gertrude would even charge neighborhood kids 5 cents to basically do whatever they wanted to do to Sylvia. At some point, Gertrude felt Sylvia had tarnished her daughter's reputation and carved something similar into Sylvia as the movie counterparts had done. Gertrude forced Sylvia to write a note saying she ran away, and it was designed to implicate rough neighborhood boys for any abuse that was found on the body. But sadly, Sylvia would die attempting to escape before that could happen. Since there was no David neighbor boy to play hero, the police just simply arrested Gertrude and some of her children. There would be a trial, and 2 of the family would be sentenced to life in prison, while 3 of the other offenders would get anywhere from 2 to 21 years. Gertrude would eventually be released from prison after 15 years, and die 5 years after that from lung cancer. A child advocacy center was eventually erected and staffed in 2010 to memorialize Sylvia and protect future children. The movie and real-life story are close in tone and have some events take place exactly the same. The differences are mostly to give some sort of hope from life to movie, but both are hard to look at and make you wish it never happened. Ketchum's book and the movie made from it are much closer to reality than anyone should have to get.